Welcome to the Advancement Podcast. This is Taylor Schote with Tim Ware, the president of Advancement Coaching and Consulting. Today, we will be discussing practical insights for pastors and church leaders to advance your life, your work, and your ministry. Are you ready to advance?
Sitting in for Taylor Schote today is guest host Chad Mackin, lead pastor of Connect Church, Pastor Chad Mackin. Got it right that time?
When you say it like that, I'm not so sure that I'm glad to be sitting here, but I am glad, truly, to be sitting here with you today.
That was not sarcasm. That was me making sure that I got it all correct after messing it up the first time and trying to just make sure I get it right this time. So,
real quickly, I noticed your shirt.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up because it's now springtime. We're moving into to baseball season, and I believe that Major League Baseball opening day should be a national holiday. So I'm sporting my world champion Houston Astros polo because that's important. Actually, I was at a church back we used to work at years ago. I have a baseball tie, and I was required to wear ties back in that day, and I had a tie Nazi in the church congregation. I had a lady that always looked at my shoes, and if they weren't polished, she would say something if my shoes hadn't been polished. And then I had the lady that would come up and inspect every tie that I wore, and she hated that tie, but I told her, this tie I wear the Sunday before opening day every year, so just get over it. And so today we celebrate my favorite professional sport. You're a basketball guy, though.
Yeah, but I love baseball. There's something about it that you can't replace. Nothing can. It is America's pastime, or at least it was. And
I still think it is.
All I'm glad for is that you are wearing that shirt rather than that tie today.
I almost brought the tie to show, but I thought that might be a little too much.
I'm so thankful you didn't.
But I am wearing my shirt. So go Astros. I know you're a Ranger fan, but go Astros anyway.
Let's podcast.
Let's podcast. So we teased this episode where today we're going to talk about the power of evaluation. We teased it in our last episode, which we were talking about. We've talked about leading up to Easter. Then we talked about what to do just on the backside of Easter or a big day. And one of those steps was that you have to evaluate. And evaluation really requires, we thought, an entire podcast in its own, because we actually did one back in the fall, episode 6, when we were first getting started on the idea of personal evaluation. And Taylor and I did that one, and it really went well. So I don't want to revisit all the theology, but I think we should start by realizing, that evaluation is actually a kingdom principle. Anybody that doesn't believe that, then you just really haven't read the scripture very clearly, because there's constantly moments, and Jesus sends out the 72, they come back, and the first thing they do is evaluate how it went, right?
Right.
And they're going, we did this, and Jesus goes, yeah, I'm celebrating with you. I saw Satan falling. And then he gives this moment of, but you need to be celebrating this instead of what you're celebrating. Right. So there's an evaluation. When we get to heaven, there's going to be the book open, and we're all going to stand there, and these deeds are going to be read off. The first evaluation is your name in the Lamb's Book of Life? Did you choose me while you were there? That's a pretty big evaluation. And for those who say yes, then we go to the other book, and he says, okay, now let's look at what you did. So evaluation is a kingdom principle. Evaluation is closely tied to accountability. The truth is, you can't. Accountability doesn't work without evaluation.
Right.
And the kingdom runs, I like to say the kingdom runs on accountability. So evaluation is an important thing, and there's really a great theology around it. But we're not going to dig into that other than to say, if Jesus evaluated and he's going to evaluate us, he's evaluating us now. And so we need to be practice that. I think it's important that we practice the things that Jesus practiced, and evaluation is one of those things that he did, and will be practicing. So, technically, you can go all the way back to Genesis at creation. At the end of every day, the Lord evaluated and said,
"It's good.
It's good." So that principle's in it's a kingdom principle, so we should apply it in the kingdom. I think that's what's the big deal for us leading into this. But let me just, before we get into the practical pieces, now you've been serving you've served on staff in churches for how long? You've been serving on?
Over 15 years.
And what would you say, how important and how effective have you seen, or has evaluation been a premier piece of was it important?
I think in seasons it's been important. Coming off of big events, having sort of an annual evaluation process of how did we do for the year. But I would say maybe in smaller pieces in the day-to-day would be where I haven't always seen that evaluation be as effective or to be held to some of the day-to-day things. And for a person like me, I need some of those day-to-day evaluations and to understand for the sake of accountability and how I'm moving forward to make sure that I am moving.
So let me ask the question a different way. Would you say that in your experience and observation in churches you've worked in other churches, would you say that evaluation was something you did or was part of the culture?
I would say that was more of what you did than it was ingrained in the culture of it.
Well, I think for us, that's an important thing, because if it's a kingdom principle, then I really want it ingrained in the culture of my church. I don't want it to be something that people go, oh, are we going to do it? They just need to know that this is what we do. This is part of what it means to be a believer, to be a leader, to be in the kingdom. Yeah. So I think that's important. Now you brought up a great point, because the first question when I start talking to leaders about evaluation is the first thing they ask. So when do we evaluate?
Right.
When do we evaluate? Well, traditionally, there's always this annual evaluation moment, right? Now, but so when do we evaluate? There are some things that we evaluate annually, and we should. Now, some of those things, there are some things we only evaluate annually, because there's some things if you look at them too often, you get lost in the muck and the mire, and It becomes too much. So the highest level things, we don't need to look at we need to look at them annually.
Because I think that there are ebbs and flows in ministry. There are ebbs and flows in our life.
Right.
Moments where we're more productive than others, and we're just going to experience those different seasons. And because of that, I think it's good to take that annual step back to look at the whole rather than in that moment. So I agree with that.
You said what we learn in studying leadership is we need to set annual goals. We need to set multiple year goals. And really, what I'm going to evaluate annually, if we've got a 3, 5, or 10-year plan, then what I'm going to look at annually is what are the steps that were set in place that were going to move us towards the 3, 5, and 10. Obviously, I'm going to evaluate my 1-year goals, but the truth is if I'm going to accomplish a 1-year goal, I've actually got to evaluate our progress towards that throughout the year. So the things I'm really looking at that I'm just taking a bigger piece, and I'm really saying this is my annual evaluation I'm evaluating the things that are supposed to be moving me towards my longer term goals, because the 1-year goals I've been evaluating as we've been moving through the process, which leads you to the things that we need to say, okay, I need to evaluate these things quarterly. And when we start talking about quarterly, I'm really taking a look at I'm really taking my snapshot. I've taken my 1-year goal, and I started those things the measurables that we've said, this is where we feel like the Lord's wanting us to lead, whether it be number of people coming into faith, the attendance, giving, whatever it is, whatever those goals were that we set annually. Those are the things that we need to evaluate quarterly. How have we done to get us to there? From here. So those things come in quarterly. Then there are also, but quarterly, we also can look back and say, okay, if I've got to get to where I need to be for the quarter, I've got to set quarterly goals, and I evaluate those things on a monthly basis. And then there are things we evaluate weekly. Obviously, your wife is evaluating your sermon every week.
Yeah, she is. I just tell her, can you wait at least 2 or 3 hours until it's over before you evaluate?
Don't start when we get in the car,
That's
please.
correct.
Yeah. Don't start that fast. My ego can't handle it.
Yeah, I only want the positive things over lunch.
That's right. Save the rest till dinner.
Yes.
That's right. But I think the reason it's important for us to talk about what we evaluate weekly is because our tendency sometimes to dive in too deep. We always tend to watch attendance weekly. We watch guests weekly. We watch finance in offerings on weekly, and it's okay. But knowing is different than evaluating. Observing, I think it's okay to observe things like that, but there are some things that they move, they're too fluid, and we need to look at trends. So when I want to talk about attendance, I don't want to talk about my weekly attendance. I want to talk about I want to look at our monthly giving, I want to see because that gives me an actual better picture, especially in a day and time when the average churchgoer now, where just 5 years ago they would have said attends twice a month. Now we're hearing that it's once a month, and they consider themselves a regular churchgoer. So with these trends, I need to be looking at monthly trends to actually get a better understanding of the culture than looking at the weekly, because the weekly may be doing this too much.
Exactly.
And some of that's pay cycles. There's just so many things that go into that. But it doesn't mean that I'm not observing them weekly. Now, what are the things I'm going to evaluate weekly? I may evaluate, evaluating my sermon is okay. I think we should evaluate what we've communicated, how we've communicated. There are some pieces, but we have to be careful that we don't dive into too much detail, because then you get, I used to work for a group, and our staff meetings, we evaluated everything so much that we never we barely had time. Actually, we always ran out of time because we dug so deep into the minutia.
Yeah.
Of the bigger pieces, where deciding what you're going to evaluate at which time allows you to be more strategic and intentional in planning. So we're going to evaluate some things annually, quarterly, monthly, and weekly, and determining which ones are which. There's also, every time we do a big event, which is like what we talked about last time with Easter, your big event isn't planned unless you put your evaluation date on the calendar.
Right.
And evaluating that event is something separate from my standard regular evaluation process. I'm going to, whether it be a vacation Bible school, or we did a conference, or we did a mission trip, when any type of thing like that we're doing, I want to have ingrained into the culture that the leaders and the team and the people putting that together are going to do an evaluation.
How do you, I know in a previous podcast, there was the talk of celebration.
Yeah.
How do you bring celebration in the evaluation process for the team?
Okay, so we need to celebrate. Evaluation actually tells us what to celebrate. We need to have a quick we can evaluate real quickly, like how many people come to faith, but we have to evaluate to celebrate. I think that was podcast number 10 or something. We did an entirely thing on celebration, and the reality is, if I don't evaluate, then here's what happens. We tend to evaluate subjectively, not objectively. And therefore, we celebrate subjectivity versus objectivity. Yeah. We celebrate, man, Jesus was in our service today. The Spirit of the Lord, we could all sense His presence. Okay, well, what happened because of that? Yeah. So we celebrate a subjective thing that we could sense Jesus' presence, and worship was good because it felt good to me. But when Jesus' presence shows up, when I read in the gospel, somebody gets healed, somebody's life gets transformed, something significant, there's a marker moment.
Right.
And so I'm not saying that subjectivity is wrong, but there has to be an objective eye, because if I haven't put an objective component to it, then what am I actually celebrating? Am I celebrating the fact that, it felt good, or am I celebrating the fact that someone's eternal life was changed?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we struggle in that is, and why we need this podcast, is so that we understand the right things to evaluate. That it's not just a numbers game,
Right.
but that we're looking at the right things to evaluate, that we don't get bogged down, as you said, in the minutiae and the small things that don't matter, that ultimately aren't going to be what help us to move forward by having that information.
Well, that's the reality is, if we know when to evaluate, what's the next question? So what do I evaluate?
Right.
Well, I think that we have to evaluate the things that move the kingdom forward. It's easy for us to say, okay, church, and I know that advancing the church is important, but advancing the church, in my experience, because I've been around enough churches, some churches aren't advancing the kingdom, they're advancing the church.
Yeah.
And I want us to make sure that we advance the kingdom. So what are the things that advance the kingdom? If the kingdom advances, then the church will advance.
Correct.
Just because the church advances doesn't mean the kingdom's advancing.
Right.
I think stewardship, meaning giving and how we spend, where those funds have gone, is something to evaluate and celebrate.
Sure.
I think that's something that's important. I think evaluating, did you set a goal at the beginning of the year for how many people did you ask Jesus to bring to faith this year? In 1983, I was a member of, my family was attending a small church, a rural church. I think we had about, we were probably averaging 45 people or something. And I'll never forget Billy Dale's sermon that day. The very first Sunday of the year. He had taken the old Sunday school board down, and he put it up at the end of his service, and he was preaching an evangelism sermon. And he said to us, can we reach 53 and 83?
Wow.
Can we see 53 people come to Christ?
Wow.
And he kept that little Sunday school board up there, and every time somebody came to Jesus, we changed the numbers out.
Wow.
And so I was in the 8th grade that year.
I was 1.
Thank you.
Actually, in January of '83, I was 3 months old.
Well, in January of '83, that was the year that was right before my 13th birthday.
Okay.
So, I was in the 8th grade and ended up in 9th grade. That year was the first time I led someone to faith in Christ. It was in woodshop.
Wow.
There's so many things I could tell you about that year. That year, if I look back, was one of the marker years of my life, because that's the year I was called to the ministry. And if my memory serves me correct, we saw through that little church 56 people come to faith.
Wow. We
saw the church doubled in attendance. You say 45 plus 56. They didn't all end up in the church, okay? But the idea was we advanced the kingdom.
That's right.
And the church advanced because of it. So are we asking Jesus at the beginning of the year, are we saying, Lord, how many should we be expecting to come to faith and be added to the church? So I want to evaluate how much the church advanced attendance-wise, economically. I may want to set facility goals, but the reality is, the first things we want to do is let's measure eternal things that we can find in the Scripture. Conversions. I think we should be evaluating conversions, water baptism. Water baptism is significant.
Sure. Because
until the 1940s and really in the advent of large event, the large crusades, stadium crusades and things, the church rarely counted people who prayed a prayer to come to faith. They didn't count them converted till they had been water baptized. So, that idea, I think that's a significant. I would say that it at least is a display of discipleship and growth. If you're a Pentecostal church, then looking at those spirit baptism component is a measurement of evaluation. Sure. Because it says, did we create opportunities for that? Did it happen? When you're talking about conversions, I was working with a church, and I said to the pastor, he said, well, we're not seeing many people come to faith. And I said, okay, so in evaluating that, let me ask you a question. How often do you create opportunities for somebody to come to faith? And he was like, well, we don't really do that very often. I said, and so you're surprised that you don't get the result that you want because you don't create opportunities.
Yeah.
So, I think looking at those eternal things, it's easy for us to evaluate with the temporary in mind, not the eternal in mind. So conversions, I'm okay saying stewardship, water baptisms, and if you're Pentecostal, spirit baptisms. What other components do you think are? I'm going to ask you because you've been around this.
Yeah.
So, what are things that you feel in Connect Church are important that you should be evaluating that maybe you haven't been, or they've been? It's been subjective, not objective.
I think for us, we've even been looking. Just a conversation in the last week was how many people are using our restrooms. And I know that's kind of a weird, why would we measure how many people? Because, we're looking at doing some remodeling and trying to figure out, do we have enough room? Do we need more? I've heard a pastor say that the lid that broke, that took the lid off of his church growth was getting the women's restroom correct and having the right size and the right space. So we're looking at that, counting how many people. I don't know how we're going to do it yet. And we sure, if it's the women's restroom, probably won't set a guy outside there and figure out how we're going to count the women in the restroom. And we're all definitely not going to time how long they're in there. So I think also, we're looking at within our kids ministry, how many of our kids are coming back from the same family, not just looking at what are the numbers, but what are the families? Who
are they?
Who are they? That's correct. And trying to see that, as you were talking about, not just those static numbers, because we look at 1 week, that's a static number, but we're looking at the dynamic.
Right.
And that's where we're catching the ebb and the flow of knowing how are we doing. And I think that's where we are is trying to move beyond the static numbers and look more big picture, because that's what the kingdom is about. It's about the big picture.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think you bring up a great point with your bathroom story, because the truth is that as the church advances, sometimes there are some things that I evaluate for a season that I don't need to evaluate forever.
Sure.
Right. There are some things that there are those things that I'm always evaluate, and then I'm going to have to look at as when we hit a lid, when we hit a bump, we say, okay, we need to evaluate, and some of those things are just seasonal, and it's okay. And when the season's passed, it's okay to say we don't have to measure, we can. Until the next time it becomes an issue.
Sure.
And I think when we talk about evaluation, the next question people ask me is, so how do you evaluate? Probably one of the biggest things that I run into is that most people will only evaluate, it'll be lead pastor and his wife, and they do the evaluation. We sat down and we talked about it, or we just get the people that are paid, or we just get the board or deacons that have been voted on, and we do it in some very, very narrow, confined context. And I think that evaluating, first of all, if you evaluate in a bubble, then you get a bubble response. And you get a bubble of input. So you need to build into your evaluation process the question, who do we need here? So if I'm going to evaluate a big event, or if I'm going to evaluate, let's say Easter, then I'm going to want somebody that was in my assimilation on the backside. I want somebody that was on my greeter team. I want somebody that was in the music. That if we did a big musical part and an illustrated sermon, then I'm going to want somebody that was on the creative team who helped me with that. You know what? I'm going to want somebody that just sat in the congregation that's been here for years.
Sure.
But I also want somebody that maybe this is their first Easter. They don't have anything to compare it to except for this one. So I want to create a diverse group so I get a diversity of opinion. I want men, women. I want somebody that's young. I don't mind putting a teenager in the room as long as they can participate, not and be or mature enough to be a part of the process. So I want to create a diverse group so that I get the most well-rounded information. because as a leader and as leaders, we need the best information. And as a leader, if I'm in the room during the evaluation, I find that it's best oftentimes for the leader either not to be there or you to be the facilitator and never give your input. Because the moment you give your input, the moment you give your opinion, everybody you taint the room.
And it's hard as the leader when
absolutely
to keep your mouth shut, to not interject.
Absolutely.
And so
you've been in the room where I've led some of those, and it's so difficult. So I have to sit there and I have to be I have to discipline myself to ask questions and say, okay, so what did you think? Let me clarify that. Are you saying, I think I hear you guys saying this as a collective, so that my job is to facilitate and the room to get the clearest evaluation. Now, the other problem that I've run into, and we're really running short on time, but I think is most people don't have a good method for evaluation because it's sporadic. And, we'll do this sometimes. You say, how do you evaluate? Well, we sit and we talk about it. Well, what do you talk about? Well, if you don't have a process, then you don't always know the results you're going to get. And there are a lot of good processes. I think you just have to find a process that works. One process that a number of teams that I've worked on, we've settled on doing and settled in using, comes from a book by Edward de Bono. His book is called The Six Thinking Hats. And if you just Google Six Thinking Hats, there's multiple colors, and they all basically mean the same thing. It's just some people rearrange the colors or pick different colors or whatever. But what we've settled on is we always say that the first thing you do is the white hat. And I think sequence matters. So the first thing I do is white hat. And this is just the facts. We had this many here. It cost us this much money. We bought this many, Easter. We put out this many Easter eggs. We had this many children under 5. We had this many children between 5 and 10. Just the facts, and every fact we can dream up, and every fact that we can come up with. Every fact that somebody might want to know. If we can get it, let's get it. This is a moment to actually create information overload if possible.
Sure.
And in this part, you have to think about some of these as a leader. You actually have to do some homework ahead of time in preparation. This is where you prepare. You just need anything you can think of. And actually probably have a couple of people on call, because in the moment in a meeting, somebody will say, hey, do you know how much this? No, but let me see if I can get that. The second one would be the red hats, what we would call it, and it's the emotions. And this is, how did it make you feel? Did you feel happy? Did you feel sad? Were you frustrated? Were you comforted? Were you overjoyed? Were you energized? And you have to let nobody's emotions are inconsequential, because one group or one person in the room may have had a different feeling about something than someone else. And nobody's feelings, this is the trick as a leader in evaluating. Everybody's opinion matters. And making sure that you create that safe place, and continue to pull. Don't rush through it. Then the next one is what we say is the blue hat, the pie in the sky. What went well? What was good about this event, or good about this year, or good about this process, or whatever? What was the good part? Good. Now, you notice we haven't said anything about negatives yet. There is opportunity under feelings. Why'd you feel that way? But we're not going there yet, because the first thing that happens normally in evaluation process is when people say they're being asked to evaluate, they come in and their mind is thinking about all the things that went wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we don't. If you start with the negative, then the room becomes toxic.
That's good.
And so what you need to build up to that. You need to let the people with the dark colored glasses realize there's some rose colors in this thing. There are some wins. Sometimes the wins are hard to find, but there's always a win. I was doing this with a group, and one person said, one person in the room said, the fact that we're doing this process is a win. If that's the only win you get, there's a win.
Yeah.
Then you go to what on the list I use is the black hat. This is the, in the old West, the black hat guy was the bad guy. And so this is what went wrong. This is the bad stuff. So here we're going to go negative. We've 4 steps in, we finally talk about what didn't work well. Then the next thing we do is, this is a yellow or gold hat. This is, if we could start all over and we had unlimited funds and we could do anything we wanted, what would the people in this room, how would you do this again? What would we do? And this is a moment to let them dream and think outside the box. And then the last one is your growth component. This is a green where we say, okay, what do we recommend for the next time? Or what do we recommend? And so it moves us to that moment of recommendations. It's a pretty strong it's a process that I've used repeatedly. Again, you can, whatever process you have, use yours, but I can tell you that this is a process that you actually have been a part of one of them that I led. And because it gives us predictability, and you know where you're going. It keeps the room moving. I've been asked to do this in some contexts. We would take a 3-day event and we would evaluate with a group of 12 people. I've done this where we put 3 different groups of 12 people together, and we would evaluate a 3-day event in 4 hours using this process. So it's a process for you. And so you need to identify what you need to evaluate as far as when to evaluate different things. You got to identify what are the key things that you need to evaluate all the time, and what are the seasonal things that you need to evaluate. You need to evaluate with a team of people, and then you also need to have a method that gives you a predictable pathway for evaluation. So what's your takeaway?
I think keeping the kingdom principles in focus as we're evaluating, knowing that everything, there's a lot of temporary, there's a lot of things that we're dealing with in the day to day or week to week, but we're all doing it because of the kingdom, and keeping that focus would be my biggest takeaway.
It's good. I just thought of something. I'll put in the show notes. I'll put that 6 hats, kind of write that out for somebody. So if you go to the show notes afterwards, that'll be in there for you. But that's good. So the question that I have for you guys as we leave today is, where can you improve? Ask yourself, where can we improve our evaluation process within our church or within our ministry? Thanks again for being with us, Chad.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us today on the Advancement Podcast. The show notes are available on our website at www.advancement.cc, along with other resources. Again, this is Taylor Schode on behalf of Tim Ware and the entire Advancement team. We want you to remember that you are meant to advance.